So welcome everyone to today's talk. It's a pleasure to moderate this event with my two colleagues, Dale and Alia. And so let me first introduce them. So Dale Hudson has taught since 2010 at NYU Abu Dhabi in the Film and New Media program. It's a program that he actually largely contributed to shaping as he worked to center the curriculum on Southwest Asia, North Africa, and South Asia, to reflect both the institution's location and its student population. His research explores film and digital media from these regions and examines visual culture in relation to environmental justice and globalization. This work was published in various academic journals, among which After Image, Arabian Humanities, the Cinema Journal, the Journal of Palestine Studies, and many others. It also resulted in a co-authored book, Thinking Through Digital Media, Transnational Environments and Locative Places in 2015, and a book called Vampires, Race, and Transnational Hollywoods, Traditions in American Cinema Series in 2017. In addition to his research and teaching, Dale also works as a curator. He's the digital curator for the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. He coordinates a program called Film from the Gulf during the Film Festival of the Middle East Studies Association. And finally, he's involved in the Association of Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Studies as a member of the board of directors. So I'll turn now to our second speaker, Alia Yunis. Alia is a visiting associate professor at NYU Abu Dhabi, where she teaches in film and new media and the heritage studies. She's also someone who wears multiple hats. In addition to being an academic, she's a filmmaker, a photographer, and a writer. And so as an academic, she recently completed her PhD dissertation at the University of Amsterdam under the title Coming Soon, Encounters on the Road to Film and Heritage in the UAE. As a writer, she has produced both fiction and non-fiction writings that focused on Arab and Muslim identities in the Middle East and in their global diaspora, and that have appeared in numerous books, magazines, and anthologies. As a filmmaker, she has directed a feature documentary, The Golden Harvest, which is currently circulating in film festivals. And finally, in 2010, Alia co-founded the Zayed University Middle East Film Festival that I had the chance to attend a few times, and that is now the longest running film festival in the Gulf. She is also one of the two co-founders of the UAE National Film Library, housed at Zayed University. So we're here actually today to discuss a special double issue of the Middle East Journal of Culture and Communication, entitled Film and Visual Media in the Gulf, which has just been published and was co-edited by Alia and Dale. This special issue has been developed from papers presented at the Film and Visual Media in the Gulf conference that they both organized in 2018 at the NYUAD Institute. This conference, and correct me if I'm wrong, convened more than 40 speakers. It also included a photography exhibition and notably a screening of the Kuwaiti film Bas Ya Bahar, Cruel Sea in English, in presence of its now late director, Khaled As-Siddiq. And this is important because this film is considered the first narrative feature by a Gulf national. So this special issue includes 10 articles on media practices around the Gulf. And I found it a very interesting read in particular because the authors look at a wide range of visual media, cinema, photography, TV series, digital media, and also a wide range of actors and uses. So the articles go from looking at how a global industry like Bollywood shapes the media landscape of the region, to exploring how second-generation foreign residents represents their conflicted identities in amateur YouTube videos that are shot in their free time. And of course, these are sort of two examples of the poles in between these articles evolve. Many of the text in this issue can be read actually across a spectrum that evolves between formal and informal media, between legal and pirate uses, between what these visual media depict or even bring out into the public sphere and what they obscure or invisibilize. But I'm going to stop here and let Dale and Alia tell you the rest. And so just before that, a note for the audience. If you would like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So please type your question at any time, and I will make sure during the Q&A to ask it to Dale and Alia. The floor is yours.
Thank you, everybody, for being here today. And I know that some of the people who are actually contributors to this issue are here, so we're really happy to have them here. The issue is also available online, so I'll just start by saying that if you would like the link to the online version, please just email Dale or I. I'm going to start out by thanking Dale for going through this very long process with me and for our long years of collaborating on this topic. We'll commence with an overview of the journal and why we did it, and then talk a little bit about the specific chapters in it. So I am having a little trouble with my Zoom, but so the idea for this chapter was born in a couple, well, it started with a conference in 2018 that was developed over a long period of time for us, and that we were very, sorry, I'm having some Zoom trouble, that we wanted to do because we started to see patterns of connectivities and with what is called, with what we were thinking of as Gulf film. And we started to see these interconnections and we wanted to explore them further. And we put out a call for papers, not thinking that we would get that many responses, but we got a very huge response because it was clearly something that was on the minds of a lot of people. And that it goes with this idea of looking at the world in oceanic arenas, and the Gulf fits that framework so well. And then film and digital media also fits that. And we really wanted to take a look also at the role of digital media in this region as another way of expanding this interconnectivity. So that's, and we wanted especially to focus on the connections between Africa, South Asia, and the rest of the, what we call the Middle East, the problematic word of the Middle East. So thank you very much. And I'm going to let Dale literally start at the beginning, which is the history of the Gulf in terms of film. So go ahead, Dale.
Okay, sorry, I'm just getting the slides to work. So thank you, Laure, also for we sent very short introductions to her, and she embellished them and made us much bigger than we would make ourselves. So that was very generous of you. We appreciate that. This is some of the earliest photographs and films from the Gulf, and we use the Gulf as the term, which really is referring to mostly the Arabian Peninsula, but then also its connections with Iran, with South Asia, with Africa in general, with South Asia, and then with the rest of the world through the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, etc. So on the left of your screen, you see a photograph which was of Mubarak bin London, which is one of the first photographs. And you can begin to see an iconography that is familiar to us today, particularly since National Day is coming up here in the UAE. And over on the other side are some of the first films that were shot here. And these were actually amateur films shot by the wives of British colonizers who were here, on visits and different things, shooting images of things that they found interesting. They were mostly formal visits for different, I think these are celebrations at Eid or something, but you can actually begin to see bits of the Gulf that they're noticing, such as the women wearing niqab, but also bits of the Gulf's connection to the rest of the world. So you've got these people playing instruments who are clearly African at some point in their lives. And those films are from the 1930s, and a lot of those are actually available online, the Dalyell collection. The next stage is kind of the documentaries that get made during the era of the oil concessions. So you've got different ones that are made, as these Emirates are beginning to enter into the world of nation states. So they're beginning to define their borders and also define the citizenship within their borders. So there's a lot of these films that are made by the oil companies themselves, primarily to promote their own business to their shareholders and also to recruit people to come work in the Gulf. And then there are other ones that are made not necessarily by the oil companies, but by other companies. So Farewell Arabia is a documentary made by the NET Journal, which is a US-based journal that was actually quite progressive in its time, making this film in Abu Dhabi that Sheikh Zayed in 1968, so before the UAE was independent. And if you get a chance to watch that film, and I think it's available on YouTube, you can listen to it. And both of us have taught this in classes, and the images are fascinating because they're images of things that existed, and they're film images, which is not so common. But the voiceover is like reading Festinger. It's complete Orientalism. So it's an interesting tension. And we point these out because these are the same sort of images that you see today, if you look through the Film Commission catalogs in most Gulf states. You're going to see these same images of the Bedouin lifestyle, the sand dunes, the Dhow, as they're called, etc. And Alia, this is you.
Okay, so we're going to take a look now at the evolution of media in the Gulf. Starts actually not with film as it does in the Western canon, but with television when they become new nation states. And one of the things that gets pioneered really is the musalsal, that has now become a staple of Ramadan. But even long before it was a staple of Ramadan, it was the expression of storytelling here in contemporary media. And the pioneers of it were within the Gulf were Kuwaitis, and most of those, though the Kuwaitis serials or musalsals were really run by the Arab expats from other countries, particularly the Levant and Egypt. And the most successful ones were making fun of the struggles Kuwait and the Gulf at large was having with modernity. And this became why they are still so very beloved today. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But what really happens that changes the media, the television production, is the arrival of the satellite channels, but that also give them a chance to see other things besides Gulf television. And also the Iran-Iraq War, which stops sort of a critical look at within state media, even of criticizing modernity. And so you start to see other series coming up that are more nostalgic in their field, like Food, which is a UAE one, and also Frige. And then you also see the development of series that are based on Western formulas that find their way onto Netflix and are more about the exceptionalism of not Emiratis, but Gulf people, but within the context of a Western serial. So the next person, Kuwait, we'll talk just a little bit about it later, but Laure already mentioned Khalid al-Sadiq, who's the director of the first Gulf, what we call the first Gulf film, in the sense that it was the first feature-length film directed by a Gulf citizen. The first actual feature film from the Gulf was done by Disney in cooperation with the ruler of Bahrain, and it was called Hamid and the Pirates. But Khalid al-Sadiq's film is the first film, and actually in many ways the only Gulf film directed by a Gulf citizen that plays internationally to a wide audience. It's the only one that is still considered a masterpiece, and it comes at a time where he made the film. Then there's this huge gap where very few filmmakers attempt to make feature films until the early 2000s, which we'll address a little bit later. But the significance of this film is that it was self-financed, so he had no state funding. He's a self-taught filmmaker, and he looks at the pearl industry, and he looks critically at the society in terms of a rape scene that was actually banned in the original by the government of Kuwait, so it didn't screen there for many years until he chose to remove that scene. It's also, while there's many flaws we can find with it in terms of it ignores the other people that would have been on those pearl diving ships, but it remains a critical film of the society, which rarely shows up after that. And then we put this, we actually feel very privileged and saddened to know that we did the last public interview with him before his passing. So that's him when he came to visit us during the conference. And the next slide is of this to show, we also want to take a look in the context of this volume at how that, yes, the Gulf came late into the production of film, but it's also, and even the production of television, but it's the leader when it comes to digital consumption. It has the highest penetration of mobile phones in the world. And that might be the reason, or smartphones, I should say, and that might be the reason why television viewing has been decreasing here, while consumption of series and YouTube programs on phones and other devices has increased. And this is true all over the world, but the rate in the Gulf is the most rapid. So we just wanted that as things that we frame. And also that online digital media, if you look at what's being produced in the content, has a lot of, well, the top influencers in the Arabic speaking world are all based in the Gulf, whether they're from the Gulf or not. They've based themselves here. The ones with millions of followers tend to be people that speak about beauty and beauty tips, and also the ruling, some of the ruling family members. But there's a great quantity of short videos of it also online that that really are where the critical look at society is going now that it's no longer being produced on TV. And these are some examples of some of the performers that have created content online with huge followings that are critical of the society. And that's what online has opened up the door for. And then I'm going to turn it over to Dale to talk a little bit about the industry.
Okay. And so a lot of our contributors actually get into these online videos, so we're going to go into a little more depth. The other thing that I didn't mention with the oil companies is the oil companies actually did provide a service, in a sense, of providing training for a lot of the first Gulf nationals who wanted to make films themselves. So they learned, how to project films, how to shoot them, how to develop them, and created the beginning of a film culture. So they would do screenings at the company towns. And then later on, people would decide they want to make their own cinema. So it was sort of the impetus of a lot of the first semi-public, is what we would call them, cinemas. What's happening now is, and this is mostly this century, the 21st century, is that there's a lot of top-down industry that's happening. It's very much entwined within the post-oil economy strategies. So promoting an industry, the image on the upper right is the Doha Tribeca Film Festival, which was a huge festival with a lot of money. There was also the Dubai International Film Festival, which started a few years earlier, and the Middle East Film Festival, which became the Abu Dhabi Film Festival. Huge festivals, enormous prizes, lots of pizzazz, all the A-list talent from Cairo, from Bombay, from Los Angeles, etc. And what happened was it really created a great promotion for the infrastructure, but didn't really help the films that much. That doesn't mean that films weren't produced, and television does get produced quite a bit. So we've got some examples of different films. Black Gold was a film that was supported by the Doha Film Institute, starring Antonio Banderas, based on a German novelist, directed by a French filmmaker. It didn't go over very well with audiences at the festival, so it's one of the kind of mistakes. But then you've also got other films that have done quite well, that have gotten funding. So on the lower left corner, Nawaf al-Janahi's film Sea Shadow, which was the first Image Nation, or the first 2454 funded film that an Emirati directed. And I think it's a beautiful film. It's about young people in Ras Al Khaimah, and it gets into post-2008 economic struggles. It's in an art film format. That film has toured all over. He's taken it to festivals all around the world, and in many places it was the first Emirati film they had seen. However, most of the production here is foreign production. So you've got loads of Bollywood shoots, particularly in Dubai, loads of Hollywood shoots here. And that's the main income, one of the main income sources. And my students were remarking in class this morning that they hadn't realized that Dune had been shot partly here in Abu Dhabi. And I said, did you recognize it? And they said, no. And then another student said part of it was shot in Budapest. And did you recognize that? No, not at all. So it's producing films, but not always contributing as much. At the same time, there are a lot of filmmakers who are making films here. And this is what we find a little bit more interesting. So we've got Bastia Bahar up on the top, and then below it is City of Life, which was considered the first big budget Emirati film in 2008 that Alia Mustafa made, and he funded that largely himself as well. It was before there was funding from the state. But then there's other filmmakers as well who made films. So we've got, and they're picking up different genres. So in the lower right corner, you've got the kind of a genre of the found footage film, and it's using Dawais, the Jin character from Russell Kaima, incorporating that into this kind of global youth film genre that plays around. And that film did well locally, but it wasn't like a festival film that screened in other places. On the other side, right below making films, there's a film called A Bahraini Tale by Bassem Al-Tawadi, a filmmaker from Bahrain. And that's a really interesting film. It's shot a lot like television. So it has all of the same television aesthetics and actors that look like television, which was something that Khaled Al-Sadiq tried not to do in his direction of the actors in Bastia Bahar. He wanted them to act in a film style. But that film is fascinating because it looks pre-1968, 1970, I can't remember the exact date, of what Bahrain was like, and you get to see its multicultural community. And this is outside a cinema where all the films are Hindi films, and everybody understands the Hindi films because that was a big popular, more popular, more interesting to look at than Hollywood films, and in some cases more accessible because of the connections across the Gulf than Egyptian films. Also, you've got people making independent films. So the middle slide on the left-hand side, on the right-hand side rather, is a film by Shazia Ali Khan called Pinky Memsab. And that's a film that looks at middle-class Pakistani women living their lives in Dubai, which is a different story than often you will get at the film festivals, where often they'll focus just on people who are citizens and sometimes white expats as well. But there's a lot more variety when you look at all the films, and these are feature films.
We're going to end this look at the sort of overview we gave you of film history and media history in the Gulf, the very, very fast one we just did, with this image. So I don't know, this woman, she appears on in a lot of ads. They call her the Camel Whisperer. Her real name is Fatma Hamdi. And she's sort of, she actually came to prominence in a TV documentary by Najum al-Ghanem, but then got co-opted into being the poster child basically for a lot of government tourism ads. And I think some of you that fly on Etihad may have seen one of the 2-minute films about her. So it's to say that, you know, that the formal state productions are still sticking to the tropes that Dale was mentioning earlier, and also to the state feminism that because of the close scrutiny on women's rights that is the Western lens on this part of the world. And so we're seeing that, and then versus online, you're seeing a little bit more exploration of narratives with people's own budgets and which is freeing them to explore different stories. And then I think we'll go through and introduce you to some of the chapters in the volume and articles. And the first one that we have is this visual storytelling, Kuwait's history told through photographs. And this was written by Badran Badran, and it's actually about A.R. Badran, who is not surprisingly his father, but he has an archive of his father's photos. His father is considered the first photographer, official photographer in the Gulf. And he recorded when Kuwait became a state, he also became its first photographer. So the archive includes photos that were made for the state and for the news agencies, and also ones that are less charming, perhaps we could say, that are about daily life there. And sometimes he was able to catch things that certainly didn't make the media. And these photos end up being a very strong recording of the history of the early Gulf and the different confluences there of the British still being somewhat in control in their own way, and also the huge amount of expats that were coming to Kuwait to work from South Asia and the rest of the Arab world predominantly. And next one, Dale.
And the next article is Samita Sunya's article, Changing Winds, Oman TV, Indian Ocean Films and Media Piracy in the 1980s. And this is a fascinating essay that she's written doing archival work. It recovers a history that isn't well known. And this is one of the things that we were very interested in when we did the conference, and delighted to see this research. And what the article, one main thread of the article is that Samita discovered that Oman TV was a large export destination for Bombay films. And it was the only TV company rather than country. And then as she did research, she found that these films were broadcast on Oman TV. And during one of the points when India and Pakistan were banning one another's films, Pakistani audiences were tuning in and watching Indian films through Oman TV. And her article goes on and also looks at how this is somehow, how this is linked, the broadcast of films, to development of VHS and eventually, I guess, VCD and different video formats for South Asian films in the Gulf, and then expands to theaters, people wanting to see them in theaters, not only from expatriates, but also from Arabs who see these films and like them.
And then we have an article from Shahid al-Shamari and Abrar al-Shamari, and they look at, brings us back to this Kuwaiti television. So we have an era in the 1980s called the Golden Age of Kuwaiti television. It's an unofficial title that everyone uses. It was also the time of the best theater being produced in Kuwait. And these series, most of them written by Talal Othman, a Palestinian, are recycled on YouTube now as nostalgia pieces, and they're watched by families now that where it's grandmothers, mothers, and daughters that are watching them, because they really stood the test of time, and they are a reminder of how modernity really affected everyone. But in this specific chapter, they look at stigma and subversion and agency, taking a look at the depiction of women and particularly women with disabilities, and how that was shown, and in contrast to the patriarchy that the women faced. And they look at 2 series in doing that. So very interesting chapter, and a very unexplored part of the Gulf's heritage when it comes to film and media.
And we also have Darshan Mini's article, Satellites of Belonging, Televisual Infrastructures and the Gulf Malayali. And this is a fascinating piece for anybody who lives in the UAE. You're very much aware that Kerala is probably home to most people. Most people in the UAE have an Indian passport. And most Indians are from Kerala. And what she did is she looked at kind of the explosion or the proliferation of Malayalam satellite television that actually acknowledges the Gulf, okay, and it brings it into its content and very much includes it. And this was another part of what we really wanted to do with the conference, was to look at how, if we look at the Gulf as a focus, it's actually going to change what we think of as Indian media, and Indian media is very much responding to it. And the media ranges, there's a whole wide range of it, and we've got a few other articles in this journal issue that get into it in different ways, but she's looking specifically at how it's creating this construction of the Gulf Malayali as a figure, right, of someone who's in both places and has gone over to the Gulf to make money and then come back. And there's different things associated with it, but it also gets into the big image that you've got there, which gets into the activism that can also emerge across the borders. So looking for people who have disappeared.
And then Hassan Hussein wrote a very interesting article about cyber tribes, and he looks at the idea, as everyone knows, the Gulf Peninsula is a tribal society, and tribes in modernity have been in conflict, and the tribes have had the nation states have been in control of what we call media, but and the tribes have sort of been excluded from a tribal identity within the media. So ironically, the very oldest formation of society in this area is the tribe that has now embraced the most modern source of community, which is social media. So he takes a very interesting look at how the tribes across many of the Gulf countries, extending to Iraq, have really kept have embraced social media as a way of keeping the tribe alive. So they're able not only to share stories, they share poetry that's been carried through the tribes for centuries. And they also are very contemporary, selling mugs and t-shirts through this social media. So and finding ways to meet and connect. So they're actually more connected now than they were 20 years ago because of social media, which again, more proof about how this this region has really embraced the digital age. Dale.
And Shreya Mitra contributed an article, Beyond the Nation and the Diaspora, examining Bollywood's transnational appeal in the United Arab Emirates. And what she's doing is she's looking similar to what Darshana was looking, but looking at it with Hindi language films. And what she did is she historicizes it by saying that we've always known for a very long time that Southwest Asia, North Africa are some of the big markets for Bombay films and later Bollywood films, amongst other places in the world, but has become even more so, particularly on the peninsula. And in the past decade, the UAE has witnessed the launch of 3 cable and satellite television channels, Zee Aflam, Zia is an Indian company, Zee Alwan, and NBC, which is the Middle East broadcast company based here in Dubai, NBC Bollywood. And what is really remarkable is that these these channels are showing Bollywood films and also some other Indian media dubbed into Arabic. And it's doing that because primarily, I think it's female audiences are watching these things. So she's looking at the popularity of Bollywood in Arabic and trying to think about how that really kind of changes what we think about with Indian cinema, because typically we have always thought about it in terms of Indian cinema for Indians and then within the Indian diaspora. And to think that there are these other audiences, although there obviously have been other important studies in other locations. Another article that we have is Neela Lenz's representation of non-resident Indians from the Gulf and online comedy videos. And this, she's looking at a wide variety of films, and they're mostly from people making the film have a certain privilege. So their consciousness of that class, of that privilege. So on the right-hand side of the screen is a young man from Kerala who grew up here in the UAE, making a film about young people trying to pretend that they're Arabs and trying to pretend that they're Emiratis. And it's kind of a joke that gets into some complicated issues. It gets into what is it like to be a South Asian growing up here in the UAE, where you don't feel like you're Indian, you don't feel like you're Arab, you don't feel like you're Emirati for sure. You know, how do you navigate all this stuff? And then another one is from Lifetalk, which is a big Delhi company, and how it's actually considering overseas middle-class Indian families from Kerala and from other parts of India. This particular one is from Malayali. Looking at them as part of the nation, part of the state, people that they're pitching to in terms of their address. But what she finds is that even within the comedy, there's often these images of alienation and identity. I wouldn't say crisis necessarily, but definitely reflective on their identity, which we also found in some of the early films, like what's called Malayalam home cinema, which is often about workers or bachelors, people who can't sponsor their families, and the hardships they go through. So it's an interesting take to look at these more middle class papers. And then this is still me. I'm doing all these last ones. This is Benedito Ferrara's article, Reorienting a Theme, Bollywood, Parks, Dubai, and the Off-Screen Filmic Imaginaries. And his paper was really interesting for us, and I think for him as well, is because this is the very first theme park dedicated to Bollywood. And it's not in India, but it's here in Dubai. And what he does is he goes through and does an analysis of the multiple, and it's almost, you have to read his essay to get it, because he's looking at so many different vectors of ways into it, of looking at the Orientalism being reorientalized and deorientalized, and really gets into the complexities of these imaginations that happen in the theme park. Looking through the fantasies of violence, particularly through Cholet, but then also through the spectacle of dances. And it's a fascinating look at how Bollywood is imagining itself as more than just films, but as kind of a media empire, and looking specifically here at the Gulf, where people are coming, and maybe we'll go to this as one of the other tourist destinations that they go to while they're here. And then oh no, wait, we've got one more. Is this me or you too, Alia?
I can do, which is this Muhammad? I'm like, so, yeah, so I can do it if you want. Sorry, I'm the one, the Zoom troubles. This is also visual storytelling in the Arab virtual public spheres. And in this article, Muhammad Aish looks at how moving into this virtual space that Arab youth are now engaging with media as something they want to do, that it's actually a profession, a place of storytelling that makes storytelling almost a legitimate career, let's say, and that this is all, and that there's a shift away from the categorizing yourself as Arab or Muslim, but that where it all connects on social media for youth today. So this virtual visual storytelling, also a very important subject.
And then finally, the last essay in the specialist is Bindu Menon's Migrant Images, Lateral Agency and Effective Citizenship in Dubai. And this is another study. We had a lot of studies that looked at different expatriate media that was created. And in this particular piece, Bindu is looking at people who are from the Philippines, Pakistan, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Iran, and Nigeria. And she's looking at a wide array of people, whether it's people who have just come over, as someone who's come over for a job, or people whose parents came over and they were born here. And she does a very detailed analysis of all these different communities and all these videos. And some of them are video diaries, like the images on the left-hand side of the screen, I think are both from one video diary of a young woman who grew up here in Dubai. So Dubai is home for her, but not exactly home because she doesn't have this citizenship. And it's a really interesting looking at, and this is something that Bindu is working on in other work, looking at oceans and waters rather than territorial bodies as places where media gets constructed. So it gets constructed between that back and forth traffic between India, particularly Southwest India, and the Arabian Peninsula, in addition to other places that are coming through. And to end our little presentation, we just collected some images for future research. And these are more, it gives you kind of like an idea of the different things that are happening here. So on the upper left corner is the History Museum in Doha, which has these amazing video projections, and they've hired I think that's the right museum. And they've hired these filmmakers from all over the world to direct videos that are projected on 4, 5, 6, 8 different screens with high resolution films as part of the storytelling of the museums. In the center, you've got the picture of the Star Wars characters posing from the Emirates Palace Hotel with 2 people representing UAE in national dress, which is the outward looking of the top end film production. Next is the Red Sea International Film Festival, which was launched in Saudi Arabia to fill up the gap from the ones that were canceled over here. Again, with the same sort of orientation, both towards Cairo for commercial films in Arabic, but also to the West, also to India. On the lower left is Shah Rukh Khan in one of the Dubai tourism. So you've got lots of Hollywood stars, and then only Shah Rukh Khan from Bollywood that do videos that are to promote tourism and their media stardom is part of it. In the center is Corfacan, which was a film that was commissioned by Russell Kaima, and gets into the Portuguese interventions here. And then finally on the other side is Mijun Aranen, who's a documentarian that Alia mentioned with the Camel Whisperer. And this is an installation she did from the Venice Biennale that was just up here last week at the Abu Dhabi Art. But just to show you that there's all sorts of things going on. While social media is extremely interesting for us as scholars and interesting for our students, there's also these big top things going on, which are large money products. Right, and that's our overview for the issue. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Dale and Alia. So before I start with a brief discussion, I just would like to invite all attendees to ask their questions. So please use the Q&A box that is at the bottom of your screen, type in your questions, and I will ask them to our speakers. As a conversation starter, I just wanted to maybe highlight a few elements that you've touched upon in your presentation and that are, I think, transversal to the articles in this issue. And that will lead me to one or two discussion questions that I would be curious to have your opinion about. The first element that I see is sort of the variety of media formats and types that are discussed in the articles, and I think many of which are actually constituted as research objects for the first time. I'm thinking in particular of these comedic videos about second generation and non-resident Indians, or these websites and forums that are meant to represent and to gather the members of tribal formations in the region. The second element is something that is very striking, I think, throughout these articles is the consistency of the Gulf's regional connections, and I mean region in the large sense across the Indian Ocean. That are, on the one hand, these connections are very present in the formal media institutions and infrastructures, but they're also present in what one of the authors calls these peripheral media, media that escape the official networks of distribution and production. And I think it's very striking how the intersections between the Gulf and South Asia in particular happen at all of these scales. But also how, at the same time, these distinctions between top-down and bottom-up are sort of constantly blurred as well in the materials that are examined in the issue, and many connections between them are elaborated. For example, how the sort of formal Malayalam satellite television networks actually become an outlet for Keralite residents in the Gulf to express diasporic concerns, or even can become a substitute for the work that the Indian embassy is not doing, right, for this diasporic community. But also how, on the other hand, expatriate vloggers who go in Dubai and film all the touristic landmarks in very well-produced aesthetic videos that are posted on YouTube. And so I thought this sort of blurring of boundaries between these more formal or informal networks and how these diasporic expressions are woven into it were quite interesting. The third element that I think is very striking and that you've mentioned is the multilingualism. That seems to be a characteristic dimension of almost all the cultural productions that are analyzed in this issue. Whether it's Hindi content, film and series that are dubbed in Arabic on official Arabian Peninsula channels, or videos that borrow from English, Malayalam and Hindi, or Tagalog and Arabic, etc. So this linguistic diversity and the forms also of borrowing and code switching that are involved with it is, I think, something that is still very understudied in the region, and that appears very prominently in this cultural production, or that they help to make very visible. And that's something that you also address in your introduction. And the last point, which to me is not only one of the contributions of this volume, but also highlights what film and media studies can bring, I think, to our understanding of the region, is also something that you underline in the introduction, which is that these media and cultural productions offer a glimpse into the foreign middle classes of Gulf residents, and as well as the local middle class, actually, in the sense, and this very much detracts from binaries that often portray Gulf societies are as these very pyramidal systems between rich citizen elites and exploited labor underclasses. And what this issue shows is that de facto, these middle classes constitute the main market for media networks, but also the main producers as well as audiences for many of these cultural productions. And so in a sense, media producers have been much quicker to recognize the existence of these middle classes than scholars of the Gulf have. And so I think this is an interesting aspect of this issue. And so this helps me transition to my first question. And I'm going to ask the two in a row so that we can then take questions from the audience. But so the first question I had is that there seems to be across this volume the idea that there's a shift in who gets to represent the Gulf and who gets to speak from or about the Gulf, but also in what Gulf realities are represented. And so you've talked about how the first images were shot by oil companies, and it's interesting also to see how vloggers or YouTubers who are foreign residents might make videos about the Dubai frame or the Dubai Mall, while Gulf feature filmmakers represent landscapes that are much further away from the glitzy skylines that are Ras Al Khaimah or other places. And so I was wondering if this is something that you would argue, actually, that there is a shift in who represents the Gulf and in what in the Gulf gets represented in these media. And the second question is about frameworks, because in your introduction to the volume, you talk about the obsoleteness of areas and area studies understood in a sort of strict essentialist sense. And you make the point that Gulf media cannot be understood as strictly located in a geographical area, and also that it cannot be confined to one language or to one ethnic and or religious community. And I was wondering here if it wouldn't be possible to actually reverse the lens. That is, rather than seeing that as something that questions the existence of the Gulf, rather seeing it as the possibility to redefine the Gulf, or seeing these media as an outcome of the Gulf understood precisely as this nexus of circulations, of diversities, of encounters across ethnicities and languages. So in other words, are these media multilingual, connected across regions because they are not squarely from the Gulf, or on the opposite, that make them precisely a product of Gulf societies? I hope that's clear.
Yeah. Dale, should I do the first one and you do the second one?
Okay.
Mine maybe more from the aspect of a filmmaker in terms of looking at representation and how it works. And I'm thinking about how you and I first met, Laure. And that was when you came to ZU and you wanted to look at the National Film Archive that we were, and it's a big word, but that's the closest this country has at the moment. And you wanted to come and look at it. And it wasn't really available for the public, but we made a way that you could come in and see. And I think for you then, you realized what we also realized from those independent films that were being made for no money. They had such really, really rich stories about things that nobody was talking about. But they only were being made at the grassroots level, and they were only being showed to other filmmakers. They didn't really have a window. And then for a more general, because social media wasn't this big, we're talking about films that were made in the early 2000s or earlier. And those films for me tell me a lot more about Gulf history in the 1990s and earlier than the official documentaries that are sitting in the vaults of the state TVs. But they didn't have an audience. And then even when they finally got a chance for an audience, it was through the establishment of these big, lush film festivals that helped fund them. But then within funding comes following a party line, so to speak, and also gearing them towards film festivals, gearing them towards European film festivals, so that they're looking at these films that were also getting funding from Europeans as being made for an audience that wasn't themselves and wasn't their communities. It was being made for a festival. It was being made to get seen in Europe. And so I think with digital media now and social media now, and actually the removal of the festivals, you're seeing a lot of student filmmaking, but other young people's filmmaking, where they're just making films because they have the story and they're going to tell it, and they're not worried about whether they have a budget. They're not worried about who's actually going to see it, or if it's going to be 90 minutes that's required for TV programming or whatever. They're just making the film they want to make. And maybe these films aren't so amazing to watch in terms of technique and cinematography or sound, but they're really compelling in terms of story. And what they tell you that you cannot see in walking down the street, and what you cannot see turning on official TV or even any of the other satellite TV available. So that's how I would think about representation, that we now have a chance for a lot of different representation, but who are the viewers? And that's and filmmaking is also affordable for a lot of people. So that's another thing. Dale, I'll leave. I know because Dale and I have gone back and forward on the second one for a very long time over the past 2 months. So I'm going to turn that one over to him.
Okay, I'm going to extend a little bit, Ali, what you were saying. The other, we didn't mention the Emirates film competition, or at least we didn't stress it, I think, if we mentioned it, which was initiated by the Abu Dhabi Cultural Foundation, but then it was merged into the Abu Dhabi Film Festival. And what Ali is talking about is, I remember going to the Emirates film competition, to the screenings, and they were very different from the other screenings at the Abu Dhabi Film Festival because everything was in Arabic only. It wasn't translated. So it wasn't for a major audience. It was just for people here. And these films are the ones I was seeing were a little bit later than the ones that Ali was referring to, which were even a generation before really getting into local stories. And I mean, I would go to them for that reason, because I was like, I've moved here, what's going on here? What are the debates? What are people asking about? And, as someone who's, an expatriate here, that was my only access into finding out what young high school students were talking about, what older people were talking about. And that's completely disappeared to a large extent. Saudi Arabia has picked it up with the different interventions there, the young makers, but they're doing it in a little bit more professional and high grade sense. Other things that, Laure, that came up in the points that you made in the questions is there was an earlier study on pop culture on the peninsula that came out of Exeter. And at that point, it was mostly only Arabic language channels on television. So the media landscape has changed so much. So not that there's loads of Hindi ones and Malayalam ones. I mean, there were more other ones as well, but there were, the larger percentage was Arabic. So it has diversified in that sense. At least that's the thing I'm getting. In terms of the framework, this is what we've been talking about. Ali and I have been talking about a lot. So we're working on a book, and there's some people who are here who've contributed interesting chapters to that volume, which also comes from the conference. Was we wanted to think about what is the connection between area studies and film and media studies. And area studies brings a depth. It brings linguistic understanding of the languages that are spoken. It gets into the deep history. And that's something that's extremely valuable. But area studies, the way that it's taught at most US universities, is it does come from something that was formed during the Cold War. It's the areas defined by the US, by the CIA, etc. So it's separating the Middle East and North Africa from the rest of Africa, and also from South Asia and from Central Asia, and from all these different places. So it has that limitation. And when we've looked at the history of books and articles that were published on films within these different, quote, areas, and particularly the Gulf, they were usually using the lens from that place. So of the little bits that were written about Bashia Bahar, they get into Kuwaitis, Gulf Arabs, but they don't get into all the people that are not in that film. So we kind of want to introduce that into it as well. Don't get into the television being expatriates coming here. So we want to bring that in a little bit. And also we want to make it an intervention to media studies, because media studies tends to segregate film from television, from digital. And they're so entwined here. And as Ali had talked about, television is really the main medium that people will sit down and watch together during Ramadan. And we've talked to friends of ours who are filmmakers, and they're so upset because they make a film, they're so excited to get it into one of the malls here, And they ask their friends, are they going to come see it? And like, no, I'll just wait for it on video. But their friends will sit and watch these Ramadan serials, even if they hate them and think they're awful, will sit and watch them immediately as they're broadcast. So that changes things a lot. And if you look at the cinemas here, it plays a whole range of films, some that are liked by people here, some that are just through the corporate deals. But it really changes the categories that are used in media studies, which will look mostly at television broadcast. If you look at a lot of studies, they only look at the Arabic language broadcast here. And there's lots of ones going on. So this is kind of what we're looking at. And I think we definitely agree with you, Laure, in the way that you phrased it, is that this is being produced because there's such a diverse population that comes through, largely transient. Some long-term expatriates who stay for like 40 years, but generally it's much shorter, but constantly being replaced. And then, people who have citizenship, who lived here, watching their country change so much with all these foreigners washing through. And it really creates a different sense of the world that changes quite suddenly, quite rapidly.
Thank you. This is very interesting, and I guess we can also sort of link your two responses in the sense that indeed the ways medias are used or watched today sort of allows also for this juxtaposition. Like you can watch Khosh Fakad on your mobile phone and then go to open TikTok and see someone in a labor camp streaming their daily life on the app at the same time, right? That juxtaposition also very much is very much present through the current uses of this. Again, I would like to encourage any attendees to ask their questions if they have any in the Q&A box. Maybe one other question that I wanted to ask you is about sort of how this region can also be broken down to some extent, or what are because there seems to be very much, there seems to be on the one hand a trope where the Gulf tends to be represented by the UAE and by Dubai in particular. That is sort of very much now the post-city. What Kuwait was probably in the 70s. Dubai is now to the Gulf as a region. But it also seems through the articles in this issue that the connection between Dubai and Bollywood, for example, is much stronger than it is in any other country of the Gulf. And so I wanted to ask you about this centrality of the UAE and Dubai for this transnational connection, for the cultural productions in the Gulf and media practice in the Gulf, and how you perceive that. Is this a simple effect of sort of scholarship bias, right? That there are a lot more people working on these questions here than maybe elsewhere, or is it actually something that a specificity of the UAE in that sense?
I think that, it's what you said, it's Dubai's moment. So the history of this region is the same is true of Kuwait, and the same is true of Jeddah, for example, a port city that would have had a lot of trade. But the moment of trade with the world coming to the Gulf now is Dubai. So that's also media, and the media zones are all here, and so that's all part of Dubai's moment. And I think if we were to watch in terms of media now, it's to see what happens with Saudi Arabia, specifically Jeddah. Now that, because Jeddah has also a very strong connections to South Asia and Bollywood, that what will we see? Will we see that media landscape get more diverse? Kuwait is off the radar now because Kuwait doesn't really do much media production outside of the state television. So and a lot of Bollywood films are shot here in part. A lot of Bollywood stars live here in Dubai in glamorous penthouses. So there's that connection. Also, they're not living in glamorous penthouses in Jeddah. Not now. So yeah, that's also part of it. So the affinity between the two is really strong. It has been for centuries, but now it's stronger than with the rest of the Gulf because it's also their second home for a lot of wealthy Indians.
I think just to add a little bit to what Alia said, I think the other thing is that a lot of the Saudi money in media goes through Dubai at the moment. So NBC, Rotana has a big presence in Dubai. So it's been oriented that way. And also I know this from a work that other scholars have done, is that Dubai was the center for the GCC states in terms of getting certification for films to be exhibited. So it kind of has, gradually become a big player. And the other states have chosen other ways. So Qatar is quite interesting because the Doha Film Institute verbed a little bit towards Hollywood with its association with Tribeca, the Tribeca Film Festival, realized that that was probably not the best move, ended it, and rebranded itself, and now has two festivals that are much more oriented, I think, towards local audiences and much more less alienating than the Hollywood ones would be. And they're funding, a lot of films that would not be funded other places, which Abu Dhabi has done as well. They've funded some very problematic films, to be sure, but they've also funded some films that English language Hollywood films that would not have been funded otherwise, and tell some stories that need to be heard by Hollywood audiences. In addition to the connection with Bollywood. Bollywood and Mollywood, if we want to call that, for the Kerala industry.
So there are two questions from the audience, and since we're already getting out of time, I'm going to ask them together. So the first question is, given the work you've been doing to chronicle the past and contemporary moment of visual media in the Gulf, what future trends seem to be opening up in terms of transnationalism, both in representation, identity included, and collaboration, global capital and soft diplomacy as possible points of reference? And the second question is, the late Khaled Siddiq was a pioneer in film in the Gulf. Is anyone studying indigenous media pioneers in the Gulf and their contributions?
Dale, do you have, I'll start with the first question, and then you can add on to that. Maybe I'll actually do the second one first because it's a very short answer. The indigenous media in the Gulf doesn't go back very far. It's been pretty well chronicled. Badran's article about the photographers and then the earlier British colonial photographers have been documented. So so that question I think it's been pretty studied, but maybe we could, and there's some interesting work coming out from Firat Orak in University of Qatar, Georgetown, Qatar, and also, and which should be in the forthcoming anthology as well. Yeah, and then for the bigger question, actually,
Alia, while you're doing that, I'm going to add a little bit to that last question. The one history that hasn't been explored that much is amateur film. And part of it, this is something that media scholars talk about constantly. So I was just talking actually with my students today about how India, at the big archive in Pune, it collects the state media and the commercial media, but it doesn't collect amateur media. So we looked at a film that recuperated amateur media and made it into experimental film to kind of look at this history that hasn't been told. Here in the UAE, the National Archive does have some film that people have donated and it's been accepted into it, but I don't know of anybody who's gone through it. And Alia, you would probably know better than I would, and studied it a lot. And maybe more will go in later on. So there is that part of filmmaking that hasn't been received that much. We have colleagues who are working on this in Kuwait as well, looking at the film archive there and the different archives of theater. So there is a lot more work to be done that we don't know about, but it's going to be, I think, mostly amateur.
And very little of it. For example, Khaled Siddiq, like when I was talking back and forward with him, and I became his friend, like to get random chats with him about his films over the last 2-3 years, and he didn't have any of his films. He made several short films before he made Basya Bahar, and he doesn't have any of those films, or he didn't, may he rest in peace. And I think we tried to find the first so-called feature film made in Abu Dhabi, and the family of the filmmaker has nothing of it. So that's the problem, that nobody cared about preserving film. And I suspect looking towards the future, this is going to be the problem with digital media too, is anybody archiving it. But yeah, and then to ask, we're out of time, I know. So to answer the bigger question, co-productions are definitely happening. So that, and on the business sense, with Bollywood, with Hollywood, with even Nollywood, everybody comes here now, and the Gulf gives its money, spreads its money to other countries. In terms of production, in terms of content, that's a bigger question. And yeah, I think there's still a lot of self-censorship for good reasons. And so, yeah, where we go with stories, that becomes a question of what's at risk for you to tell that story.
Dale, do you want to add a few last words to this answer?
I think another thing that also is emerging here is that I think that there's going to be new media forms, not just coming out of the Gulf, but around the world in general. And this is something that I've talked to lots of colleagues around the world about. So TikTok, during the pandemic, we were all like, how do we teach classes when we're on Zoom? And particularly for colleagues who teach filmmaking classes. So a lot of people were talking about, well, why don't we teach them through TikTok? How can you tell a story through TikTok? And I think things like that are going to launch and create a counterpoint to the top-down films that Alia was talking about that are coming here to work in the free zones. And there's still tax incentives to bring people to shoot here in the UAE. But those are the big budget films that mostly erase the UAE. I mean, some of them are exceptional. So there's a Nollywood film called Wedding Getaway 2, I think, something like that, which you can find it on Netflix and all the different things. And it's one of the big Nollywood hits, but it focuses on Dubai as a destination. It's a wealthy Nigerian family and their daughter's marrying a British guy, a white guy. So there's some controversy there, but Dubai is this place for luxurious holidays. But then most of the other films that are shot here, you'd have no idea, including the Bollywood films. They look like Dabang was shot here, but you'd have no idea what parts of it were shot here, not even the song and dance. It's just erased. So there's that part.
Thank you very much. Well, we are definitely out of time now, so we have to conclude here. Thank you so much, Dale and Alia, and I can just encourage everyone to go read the issue and hopefully have further conversations about it in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laure.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you to the contributors. A lot of the contributors were here, as well as colleagues of ours and students of ours, and also contributors to the book that will be forthcoming, because there's even more. We have some really interesting contributors in that volume.
Yeah, it was really nice to see their names in the chat.
Yes.
Yeah.
And thank you to Martin Klimka for inviting us originally to give this presentation. And thank you, Laure, for moderating.
You're welcome.